Roger didn't realize that he was in over his head until it was far too late. His wife had warned him. "Where are you going?" she'd asked. "Oh, Marcy Witherspoon asked if I could swing by," he answered. "She texted me and asked if I could come over and answer a couple of questions for her. It shouldn't take long." "And you believed her?" Yeah?" His wife had just stared silently at him. As the seconds ticked by, Roger realized that he was missing something, as happened far too frequently, but he wasn't sure what. "Is there a problem?" he'd finally asked. His wife pinned him with a steely gaze and spoke slowly and deliberately, the way she did when she wanted to make certain that he or one of the kids was listening carefully. "Whatever you do," she said, ice water dripping from every syllable, "do not promise her anything." "I think it will be fine," he replied. "She's a sweet old lady." "She's treacherous." There was silence for another 10 seconds or so. Then Roger finished putting on his jacket and he kissed his wife goodbye. He started to say something, but she cut him off. "Treacherous," she repeated. There was another extended silence. Then, not knowing what else to do, Roger turned around and left. During the short drive to Marcy Witherspoon's house, he wondered briefly about whatever it was that his wife had tried to tell him. And then, shrugging, he put it out of his mind. One thing he'd learned in 15 years of marriage was to lean on his strengths. In his case, that was a sort of simple-minded optimism. Over the years, it had served him well. It served him well as he knocked on Marcy's door. She answered it with a smile and a hug and invited him into her dining room, where a little girl was sitting. She too greeted Roger with a smile. "Have you met my granddaughter Fern?" Marcy asked. "Oh, hey, Fern," he said. "Hi," the small girl replied cheerfully. "Why don't you have a seat?" Marcy said, going to the sideboard and collecting a bottle and a couple of glasses. Roger sat down next to Fern with a smile to the girl, who grinned back at him. Marcy set the glasses and the bottle down on the table, then took a seat. She poured a slug into her glass, then looked to Roger with raised eyebrows. "Just a tiny one," he said, remembering his wife's warning. Marcy pulled a finger's worth of gin into his glass, and then raised her own in a toast. "I'm glad you could make it over today," she said. "To your very good health." They each took a sip. Roger barely touched the gin to his lips, but after a moment he raised his own eyebrows and finished it off. It was very good gin. What did you want to talk to me about?" he asked. "Oh, just a couple of committee things," she said, pulling a sheaf of papers out of a folder. She patted her neck and then the top of her head. "Ugh," she said. "I left my glasses over on the sideboard. Would you mind getting them?" "Oh, of course not," he said, getting up and fetching a pair of reading glasses. He returned to his seat, handed Marcy the glasses, and finished off his fingerful of gin. Marcy went over some figures and asked a few pertinent questions. "Ah," she said after a moment. "Right here, what's this figure here?" She pointed to a number in a column on a spreadsheet. Roger leaned over and squinted to see which number she was pointing at. It took a second, but he finally located it. "Oh, that's the accrued interest in the building fund account." "Oh, of course," Marcy said with a smile. "I lose track sometimes." "Totally understandable," Roger said with a smile of his own, as he settled back in his chair and finished off his fingerful of gin. He was bothered briefly because he thought he'd already finished off his tiny drink. But Marcy asked him another question, and he shook his head and turned his attention back to her. They went over a few more figures. This was clearly boring to Fern, and the little girl opened a sketchbook and started drawing. After a moment or two, she tapped Roger on his shoulder. "Did I draw this flamingo's legs right?" she asked. "I can never remember which way the knees bend." Roger looked at the drawing and then a little closer. "I don't remember either," he said, "but you've drawn each one bending in a different way." Fern made a confused sound, and Roger bent over the sketchbook to show her what he was talking about. "Oh!" the girl said with an embarrassed smile, and then energetically started to erase each knee on her flamingo. Roger sat back in his chair again, and he finished off his tiny drink of gin. He paused for a moment, frowning with concentration, and then shook his head and leaned on his strength of not thinking too much, and he gave his attention back to Marcy, who had another question. It was only much, much later that he realized with an aching head that Marcy and her granddaughter had each taken turns distracting him, while the other poured a slug of gin into his glass, and then distracted him again before he could think too much about it. From time to time he had asked himself whether he had just finished his drink a moment or two before, but after 2 or 3 times his head got a little fuzzy and he stopped caring too much. To give Marcy credit, she called an Uber to take Roger home, where his wife listened with a resigned sigh as he explained that somehow he, and by extension she, was in charge of the upcoming holiday bake sale, and that he was going to have to spend the next couple of weekends organizing the committee's storage lockers, searching for the props for a Vegas night fundraiser, which he also found himself somehow in charge of. In the end, it wasn't Marcy's treachery that impressed him. He had been warned, after all, but the masterful way that the little girl had blindsided him. On the other hand, it had been very good gin. It's easy to put alcohol into a couple of different categories. You've got your mixing alcohols, your gins, your vodkas, your rums. Of course there are the high-end ones, but for the most part, when you think of gin, you think of tonic. It's not a sipping alcohol the way that you would think of a top-end tequila or a really high-end rum, or, of course, various scotches and Irish whiskies. You don't think of sitting around drinking gin, just on the rocks, tasting it, savoring it. But then, every once in a while, you run into something special. Bar Hill is a label out of Vermont, and all their alcohol is made from honey. It's not like it tastes like you're squeezing honey out of a plastic bear into your mouth or anything. It is legit gin with a good flavor, but they don't stop there. They have a regular, Bar Hill gin, and it is perfectly respectable. It is a very nice gin. But then they have what they call their Reserve Tomcat gin. And what they do is that they age it in barrels, just like you would scotch or bourbon or a fine whiskey. It is something that you can sit and savor. How many things do we have in our life that we can do that with? Just sit with them and enjoy them.